I never imagined I would return from federal deployment to a home that no longer felt like mine. The flight back had been long, the type that leaves your bones humming. I just wanted the quiet of the Montgomery homestead. I had that familiar flutter in my chest, the relief of coming home after months of sterile hallways, security briefings, and court orders issued through encrypted screens. All I wanted was my land and my century-old barn. It was a little crooked, a little weather-beaten, but stubbornly still standing, just like me. But the moment my truck rolled onto the gravel driveway, something felt completely wrong. There was too much sky. There was too much empty space where there should have been history. The barn was gone, not restored, not repaired, gone, scraped from the earth like someone decided it didn't belong in their perfect neighborhood vision. What remained was a fresh scar of leveled dirt, splintered wood, and tire tracks. It told a story of heavy machinery tearing through my property like it was disposable. My chest tightened with a sharp, cold pressure. I had been gone for months, serving the same country these people claimed to protect with their little rule books. In my absence, someone had erased the only structure on the property that truly mattered to me. The neighbors peeked through blinds as if watching a live episode of a drama show. They knew exactly what had happened. Diane Whitmore, the president of Cresthaven Estates, HOA, treated the neighborhood like her kingdom. Diane had apparently decided the barn didn't meet updated community appearance guidelines. This was a barn that had been there for over a century, way before Cresthaven Estates HOA even existed. It was recorded as a historical asset in county records. It belonged to my grandfather, Henry Montgomery. He had died believing the land would always stay with our family. I stood there breathing in the dust. I felt the betrayal settle into something cold and steady rather than loud and furious. Diane had miscalculated. She expected yelling, screaming, and theatrics a meltdown she could twist into hostile behavior. What she didn't expect was silence. She definitely didn't expect that the owner of the property she bulldozed was not just a homeowner, not just a veteran, but a federal judge. My name is Victoria Montgomery. As a federal judge, I had jurisdiction over the very types of administrative abuses she had just committed. I walked the perimeter of the demolition site, making every single step deliberate and calculated. I memorized the pattern of the bulldozer tracks, the shape of the debris field, and the careless scattering of historical beams like trash. My phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls from nervous neighbors. There was a voicemail from the HOA requesting I schedule a compliance meeting. I also got anonymous texts warning me that Diane was bragging. She claimed she had finally cleaned up the neighborhood eyesore. I recorded everything: photos, videos, and timestamps. Every little detail would matter later. News spreads fast in little HOA communities, and by the time I reached my front door, Diane's car was already pulling up. She parked with that self-satisfied boldness of someone who has never actually faced consequences. She stepped out like she expected applause for what she'd done. But I didn't give her the performance she wanted. I simply listened as she smugly handed me a violation notice. It explained the demolition and the bill I supposedly owed the HOA for the cleanup. I didn't say a word, not a single one. Her smile faltered at the silence. People like her feed off conflict. Deny them that, and their confidence cracks. Inside my house, I laid the notice on the table and stared at it. It was illegally signed, with wrong dates and wrong statutes cited. It had the wrong authorization procedure. Not a single part of it followed legal process. Not HOA bylaws, not state code, nothing. It was an amateur forgery of authority. I knew exactly what I would do next. I spent my first night home drafting motions, preserving evidence, and pulling every document the HOA had ever sent. The deeper I went, the more rot I found. Unauthorized fines and misused HOA community funds. There were votes taken in closed sessions that were supposed to be public. Property decisions were made unilaterally by Diane without member approval. I even found a private, deeply offensive email chain. In those emails, Diane referred to neighbors with slurs, mocked veterans, and bragged about controlling the sheep. Worst of all, she explicitly wrote that my deployment was the perfect opportunity to strike. She wrote she needed to deal with the ugly barn before the judge lady comes back and throws a fit. It wasn't carelessness. It was targeted. By sunrise, I had a meticulously organized case file, thicker than a textbook. Unlike most HOA victims, I didn't have to beg for a lawyer or hope someone in authority listened. I was the authority. The next 72 hours moved fast, faster than Diane ever imagined consequences could move. Richard Hayes, the county inspector, arrived first. One look at the demolition site, and he immediately halted all HOA-related projects. The barn had been legally protected under historical property laws. Its demolition required 3 levels of approval the HOA never sought. Richard flagged Cresthaven Estates for violations that carried fines in the tens of thousands. Then came the Historical Preservation Board. They were alerted by my report filed at dawn. They were furious, not just because the barn was gone. Diane had deliberately misrepresented the structure as abandoned and unsafe just to push her own selfish agenda. The board froze the HOA's authority pending investigation. But the real blow came when the state attorney's office opened a criminal investigation. They looked into property destruction, fraud, and abuse of power. Diane had forged documents to authorize the demolition. That alone carried the potential for jail time. While the storm built, the neighborhood grew restless. People whispered on sidewalks and deleted old messages. They dug up screenshots of Diane's previous power plays. Once the first crack appears in a tyrant's armor, everyone suddenly remembers every wrong they ever suffered. I watched it unfold quietly, never engaging. I simply let the truth surface naturally. On the 4th day, a full audit of the HOA was ordered. Residents lined up to give statements. Fear had evaporated. Diane's reign was collapsing faster than my barn had. The final blow came when the local news station aired a story on the illegal demolition. Mrs. Helen Albright, a sweet, elderly neighbor who often brought pies before my deployments, gave an emotional interview. She talked about the barn's history and how heartbroken I must be. She didn't mention my occupation, but someone at the courthouse clearly recognized the name. Reporters dug deeper. The story spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the narrative flipped. It wasn't just a barn. It was a historical family landmark destroyed by a corrupt HOA president, while the owner, a federal judge, was serving her country overseas. The backlash was brutal. Diane tried to host an emergency HOA meeting to explain her side. Only 3 people showed up, and 2 of them were reporters. The rest of the community attended the meeting I held in my yard. No speeches, no legal jargon, just facts. Documents spread across tables, evidence neatly labeled. An entire neighborhood realizing they had been controlled by a woman who believed she was untouchable. Within a week, Diane was removed from her position. She was ousted by a unanimous vote. Within 2 weeks, she was charged with multiple counts. This included property destruction, falsifying legal documents, misuse of funds, and harassment. Her attorney begged for leniency. But the law is the law. That's something she should have respected before she decided to bulldoze a century of history out of pure spite. The court ordered her to pay full restitution to the Montgomery homestead. She owed 3 times the value of the barn under historical property protection laws, plus legal fees. She also had to pay community compensation for her misuse of funds. She lost her home before the year ended. The proceeds went toward rebuilding what she destroyed. But the barn was more than lumber and nails. It held memories that couldn't be reconstructed. Still, I rebuilt it exactly as it was, beam by beam. I used wood salvaged from the demolition mixed with newly restored pieces. Neighbors volunteered to help. People who had once feared Diane's retaliation now stood proudly on my land, reclaiming their community. It took months, countless hands, and a lot of healing, but the structure rose again. Not identical, but stronger, symbol, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by someone drunk on petty power. Sometimes I stand in the doorway of the new barn at dusk, watching the sunlight filter through the beams. The land feels whole again. Not just because the barn is back, but because true justice was finally served. Diane had believed she could do anything, that rules were for other people. She thought authority was a tool she could forge as she pleased. She didn't know that authority, real authority, answers to the law. Not ego, not HOA politics, but the law. And I am the law. So when people ask if I ever confronted her, if I ever raised my voice, screamed, or demanded answers, I tell them no. I simply didn't need to. Diane taught the neighborhood that fear could control them. I taught them that accountability can free them. Somewhere in a courtroom far less friendly than my front porch, Diane learned that exact same lesson. Never, ever mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes silence is just the sound of justice being sharpened.